My opponent has resolved that violent video games do not make children more violent. We, the proposition, will prove that violent video games do indeed make children more violent. A study done by Dr. Eugene Barrison, the executive director at the Clay Center for Healthy Young Minds, estimates that the average child will witness around 16,000 murders before they even turn 18. This is because of how much violence children are exposed to while they play things like violent video games. The children will develop aggressive thoughts and behavior. In a study conducted by Albert Bandura, a Stanford University psychologist, kids were brought into a room and they were given instructions to make a craft. Later, an adult entered the room with a few toys, one of them being an inflatable clown doll named Bobo. The man was beating Bobo up by kicking, punching, and sitting on him as the children watched. The children were then moved to another room with a few other toys and another inflatable Bobo doll. And the majority of the kids beat the doll up just as they had seen the man in the first room do. After learning about this, does my opponent still believe that it's a good idea to put a video game that displays actions much worse than beating up a Bobo doll to children? Yes, Crystal.
Are you comparing beating up a doll to the violent scenes in a video game?
No, I'm not. What I'm saying is that the violent scenes you're talking about are going to be sucked in as the children sucked in the Bobo doll. It's much worse in a violent video game than beating up a Bobo doll, as you probably already know. Yes, Peyton?
You said that the average child witnesses 16,000 murders before they're 14?
I said 18?
18? Well, I've never witnessed a murder before, so do I have 16,000 murders left to witness?
Yes, you have. I've been with you on the couch watching TV. Too many children have taken a turn down the wrong path because of exposure to violent video games. Jose Reyes was only 12 years old when he went into his school and shot his teacher in the head. This was because of the exposure to violent video games, and you can see in his search history, he searched Super Columbine Massacre, and that's a shooting that occurred with 2 other high school students who went in and killed many of their classmates. He shot his teacher in the head with a pistol, and this was because of the overexposure to video games that are violent, have violence in them. Playing video games can blur the line between fantasy and reality. A person who plays a child who plays violent video games might find that they try to use the violent video games to do something in real life, and they might mix up which one's which. 2 girls were made themselves believe that Slenderman, a fictional character in a video game, existed. They stabbed their friend 19 times. Thank you.
My opponent, the proposition, has resolved that violent video games make children and teenagers more violent. We, the opposition, will prove that violent video games do not make children and teens more violent. The number of people that play video games in the United States of America are around 150 million, and 71% of that number are children. Violence is defined by Merriam-Webster Dictionary as the use of usually harmful or destructive force. Firstly, violent video games allow children to release their stress and anger in a safe environment. No matter the age, everyone endures stress. Many children have found a coping method. One of these coping methods is playing video games. A peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of Adolescent Health found that children, especially boys, play video games as a way of managing their emotions. Violent video games. 45.4% of children answered that they play violent video games to help them get their anger out. With video games as their coping strategies, children have no need to physically take out their stress in real life. They won't be as tempted to disobey and rebel, instead taking their anger out on virtual characters. Secondly, nearly all studies showing that violent video games cause violent tendencies in children are flawed. Studies that attempt to find the fact that violent video games cause violent tendencies in children and teenagers usually do not take into consideration factors other than violent video gameplay. Yes?
Do you really believe that exposing children to violence that's really dangerous and stuff is a great idea for helping them cope by giving them more ideas for violent things to do?
I'm saying that instead of them not knowing how to take their anger out in real life and then actually taking their anger out on a person, them taking their anger out on a virtual character instead of an actual person. Nothing. The studies fail to follow the child or teenager for an extended period of time, see the environments they live in, or analyze their personal lives. Many risk factors are associated with youth violence. They mainly look for the correlation between children playing video games and their behavior and effectiveness, although there may be other factors in between. Lastly, the Supreme Court ruled that violent video games do not cause youth to act aggressively. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the nation. To hear that they even agree should be a powerful fact to persuade us all. The Supreme Court rejected a law that banned the sale of violent video games to children on First Amendment grounds. This amendment states that there shall be no law abridging the freedom of speech, which includes expressing oneself. Video games are considered an art form and a way of expressing oneself. That is why the Supreme Court cannot ban them. In the Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association case, Justice Antonin Scalia had said that any studies attempting to show the connection between children's violent tendencies and video games had not actually proved that violent video games cause minors to act aggressively. And with that ruling, was not even a close one, being 7-2 in the end. Also, back to my second argument, which is studies showing violent video games. Thank you.
Our opponent, the opposition, has resolved that violent video games don't cause children to have violent thoughts. We, the proposition, will prove that violent video games do indeed cause children to have violent thoughts. When our opponent, the opposition, was talking about studies attempted, they never actually gave any examples of studies that were attempted, and they regarded the question. They didn't answer the question I was about to ask about them. And so many kids have done things wrong about video games, such as the example given our first constructive about Jose Reyes. He was searching many things, including the Super Colombian Massacre role-playing game, where he wanted to become one of the people in the massacre, shooting in the massacre. And he also searched the top 10 evil children, which was a very bad thing to search. He also after examples such as Jose Reyes, who killed his teacher by shooting him in the head with a crystal.
You're talking about Jose Reyes and his search history, but have you mentioned anything about Jose Reyes actually playing violent video games?
He was searching the Super Colombian Massacre role-playing game. This was a role-playing game that was a virtual reality game. He wanted to play this virtual reality game, killing people. Peyton?
You were talking about the video game that you just mentioned. How do you know that him playing the video game caused him to shoot someone in the head? Because I don't understand how you can automatically know that without having all of the facts.
He was searching this, and he was being bullied at school, and he needed an outlet to take out his stress. He also was talking about he needed an outlet to take out his stress, and he was searching things that would also take out his stress, but he didn't take it all out in the video game and decided to shoot his teacher in the head. In conclusion, examples such as Jose Reyes, it will be irrational to assume that violent video games did not have any effect on the actual player.
I would like to point out that my opponent, in their first argument, their argument stating that video games can develop aggressive thoughts and behavior, they had mentioned the example of an experiment where the person beat up Bobo, a doll, and then the children had done the same. Well, I would like to ask, how does that compare to murder? Because although I can see the correlation between maybe beating up a doll, I don't see how, if a child seeing a murder would decide, oh, I'm going to pull out a pistol and shoot someone. Because there's obviously much more between that than just seeing it. And they had mentioned Jose Reyes, who had shot correct me if I'm wrong, their classmates and their teachers, but most child and video game correlations don't have as much proof as it seems to be. Because yes.
In the case of the two girls who stabbed their friend, in the case of the two girls who stabbed their friend 19 times because they were trying to please the fictional character Slenderman, what proof do you have? How do you say that video games did not cause this act of violence?
Well, because in that case it shows a direct correlation, but in the other cases there is not one. And if a child were, no thank you. If a child were to commit this crime, if Jose were to commit this crime and he had access to a gun, it shows that he was not in a safe environment to begin with. This proves our point, which says that these studies and these situations don't look beyond the surface. They only look to where the video games are. Yes.
When you said that in that case it caused direct correlation, so you're agreeing that violent video games did cause violence?
No, I am not. I'm saying for most. If the children are able to access these weapons to be committing these crimes that are so-called correlated with video games, then they are not in a good situation to begin with. Because they may be experiencing they could be in a bad neighborhood, they could be having a bad family, they could have bad family relationships, friend relationships. And that video games are not the only factor that could be leading them to this violence. Because if they are able to access a weapon, I don't think that they are in a safe and happy environment. And plus, if they were to want to take this stress out in using violence, I don't think that they are in a happy place with their life. And so, video games are not the only cause to child violence, and they do not directly lead to child violence, because there are much more factors that in between that can lead to this. Thank you.
We, the proposition, have proven that video games make kids violent because kids will develop aggressive thoughts and behavior. Too many kids have gone wrong because of violent video games, such as Jose, who was inspired by the Super Columbian Massacre virtual reality game, and that kids will have decreased sleep. No, my bad, sorry. Our opponent, the opposition, said that they will help get out stress with an actual video game, though, as stated for Jose, killing his teacher did not take out the cope on the video game, but on its teacher. And that studies that were attempted, there was no examples for that at all. And that, oh, okay, yes, yeah.
We, the opposition, have stated that violent video games do not make children violent because, one, violent video games allow children to release their anger in a safe environment. Two, almost all studies trying to show that violent video games make children violent are flawed. And lastly, the Supreme Court even ruled that violent video games do not cause youth to be violent, and the vote was not even close in the end with a 7-2 verdict. The proposition has stated that violent video games make kids violent because, one, the children develop aggressive thoughts, and two, they may mix up fantasy and reality. They did not state their third argument in the end. In their first argument, they stated that a boy, Jose Reyes, I believe, was aggressive because of video games. But instead, they only stated his search history. When they mentioned the VR game was